Early January 1940. A forest in the frozen heart of Finland beside a narrow road called the Rajatie Road. The temperature is somewhere around 30 degrees below zero. A Finnish soldier on skis moves through the trees, white from head to foot, almost invisible against the snow, making no sound. And out on the road beside him, stretched along that single narrow ribbon of cleared ground for mile after mile after mile, is an entire Soviet division. Tanks, trucks, field kitchens, artillery, thousands upon thousands of men, and not one of them is going anywhere. That is the thing the Finnish soldier understands, and the Soviets out on the road are only now beginning to understand. They cannot move forward because the road ahead has been cut. They cannot move backward because the road behind them has been cut too. And they cannot leave the road because on either side of it lies the thing that the Soviet planners never properly reckoned with, the deep, trackless, frozen forest into which a man on foot in ordinary boots sinks to his waist and dies, and through which a man on skis who knows the country moves like a ghost. The division on the road is one of the most powerful military formations in the world, and it is about to be cut into pieces and destroyed almost to the last man by a Finnish force a fraction of its size. Now, if you know anything at all about the Winter War, the war between the tiny nation of Finland and the colossus of the Soviet Union in the winter of 1939 and 40, you probably already have a picture in your head of how the Finns did this. You are probably picturing one of three things. Maybe you are picturing the sniper. The White Death, Simo Häyhä, the quiet farmer who killed more than 500 Soviet soldiers in under 100 days, the deadliest marksman in the history of warfare, a single man so feared that the Red Army shelled whole stretches of forest just to try to kill him. Maybe you are picturing the Molotov cocktail, the bottle of petrol with a burning rag, the homemade firebomb the Finns hurled at Soviet tanks until the snow was littered with burning wrecks. Or maybe you are simply picturing the cold itself, the merciless Finnish winter that froze the invaders in their thousands where they stood. All three of those pictures are real. All three of them happened, and here is the thing this video exists to tell you. Not one of them is the answer. Not one of them is the tactic that actually saved Finland. The sniper, the firebomb, and the frost are the things everyone remembers, the dramatic images, the stuff of legend. But the thing that actually allowed a nation of fewer than 4 million people, with an army of 300,000 and just 32 tanks, to hold off a Soviet Union of more than 150 million with thousands of tanks and a military many times its size, was something far less dramatic, something you cannot really photograph, something the Finns named after a humble stack of firewood. There is a reason we remember the wrong things, and it is worth naming up front because it is the quiet lesson underneath this entire story. Tactics do not photograph well. A method, a way of moving and cutting and isolating, is invisible. What photographs well is a lone sniper in white against the snow, a burning tank, a frozen body. The camera and the memory reach for the dramatic image, the single hero, the vivid object, and they skip right over the unglamorous thing that actually did the work. So the legend of the Winter War became a legend of snipers and firebombs and frost, of individual heroism and homemade weapons, and the real engine of the Finnish survival, the cold, patient, brilliant tactic that made all the heroism possible, faded into the background, mentioned in passing, if at all. We are about to put it back in the foreground where it belongs. To understand the one tactic that truly saved Finland, the tactic that turned the Soviet giant's greatest strength into the very thing that killed it, we have to go back. Back to a refused demand in the autumn of 1939, back to the strange geography of a frozen country, and back to a single Finnish word that describes both a pile of cut logs waiting to be split and the method by which a small nation cut a great army to pieces. The word is Motti. Start with the mismatch, because the mismatch is the thing that makes everything afterward almost impossible to believe. In the autumn of 1939, Joseph Stalin looked at the map of his northwestern border and did not like what he saw. The second city of the Soviet Union, Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution, sat only about 20 miles from the Finnish frontier. To Stalin, this was an intolerable vulnerability, and so he summoned Finnish negotiators to Moscow and made his demands. He wanted Finland to move its border on the Karelian Isthmus well back from Leningrad. He wanted to lease a Finnish peninsula, Hanko, for a naval base. In exchange, he offered a larger but largely worthless stretch of forest in the east. The demands, taken together, would have stripped Finland of its best defensive ground and left it open. Many believe Stalin's real goal went further still, that he intended, in time, to swallow Finland whole, the way the Soviet Union would soon swallow the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Finns said no. It was, on the face of it, an act close to madness. Consider the disparity. The Soviet Union had a population of more than 150 million. Finland had around 3.5 million, fewer people than many single cities. The Soviet Union could field thousands of tanks and nearly 4,000 aircraft. Finland had 32 tanks, most of them obsolete, and barely 100 serviceable planes. When the invasion came, the Soviets would commit hundreds of thousands of troops, and behind them stood the inexhaustible manpower of a continental empire. By every measure that armies are usually counted, Finland should have ceased to exist as an independent country in a matter of weeks. The mismatch was on the order of 40 or 50 to 1 in population alone. On the 30th of November 1939, when Finland refused to yield, the Soviet Union invaded. Soviet aircraft bombed Helsinki. Soviet armies crossed the border at multiple points along the entire length of the frontier. And Stalin was so confident of a quick and total victory that he did something revealing. He had already prepared a puppet government, a so-called Finnish Democratic Republic, headed by a Finnish communist exile named Otto Kuusinen, ready to be installed in Helsinki to rule the conquered country once the Red Army had marched in. This was not a war of limited border adjustment, whatever the official language said. This was meant to be a conquest. Stalin had brought along the government that would run Finland after Finland stopped existing. The world, watching, agreed with Stalin's assessment. The expectation almost everywhere was that the Finns, however brave, would be crushed in short order. The Red Army was enormous. It was mechanized. It rolled forward in great columns of tanks and trucks and men, more firepower than Finland could dream of resisting. But the Finns had a few things that did not show up in the tables of tanks and aircraft, and those things would turn out to matter more than anyone expected. They were fighting on their own ground, for their own homes and their own newly won independence, won only 20 years earlier from the collapsing Russian Empire. Finland had universal military service, and beyond the army, it had the Civil Guard, a national militia that had trained ordinary Finnish men for exactly the moment when the country might need them. And those men were, by background and culture, perfectly suited to this particular war. They were countrymen, foresters, hunters, men who had grown up on skis and with rifles, who could move through deep snow and dense forest as naturally as walking, and who could shoot. They had a commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, an old soldier of enormous prestige who had built, along the Karelian Isthmus, the line of fortifications that would carry his name. None of this closed the gap in raw numbers, which remained hopeless. But it meant that the Finnish army, however small, was a coiled, motivated, woods-wise force defending terrain it understood better than any invader ever could. The giant was about to walk into the one kind of country and meet the one kind of enemy that its overwhelming advantages were least able to handle. And it had, hidden inside all that strength, a fatal flaw. Several of them, in fact. The giant that crossed the Finnish border at the end of November was immensely powerful, and it was also in ways that would not become clear until the snow ran red, blind, rigid, and brittle. To understand how Finland survived, you first have to understand why the giant could not simply walk in and take what it wanted. And the answer to that begins not with Finnish heroism, but with Finnish geography. Look at a map of Finland, but more importantly, imagine walking across it in December. Finland is a country of forest, lake, and bog. Outside the narrow inhabited belt in the south, much of it is a vast, dense, subarctic wilderness, a tangle of pine and spruce and birch broken by thousands of frozen lakes and snow-covered swamps. In summer, it is hard country to cross. In the deep of winter, under several feet of snow, in temperatures that plunge during that particular winter to 30 and even 40 degrees below zero, it is something close to impassable for a man who does not know it. A soldier on foot in standard boots, carrying a rifle and a pack, trying to march cross-country through that, sinks into the snow, exhausts himself in minutes and freezes. Which means that a large mechanized army moving into Finland from the east had, in most of the country, essentially no choice in how it traveled. It had to use the roads, and there were very few roads. Outside the Karelian Isthmus in the south, the country was served by a sparse handful of narrow forest roads cut through the wilderness, often just a single track winding between the trees and the lakes. Tanks, trucks, artillery, supply wagons, and the men themselves all had to funnel onto these few narrow ribbons of cleared ground. And so the great Soviet columns, advancing into the Finnish interior, were forced to string themselves out along single roads for mile after mile, nose to tail, unable to spread out, unable to deploy off the road into the forest, unable to maneuver. Now hold that image, the army trapped on the road, and add to it the second great weakness, the one inside the Red Army itself. In the years just before the war, Stalin had torn his own officer corps to pieces. The great purges of the late 1930s had seen a huge proportion of the Soviet military's experienced commanders arrested, imprisoned, or simply shot, swept away in waves of paranoia. The men who remained or who were promoted to fill the gaps were often inexperienced, and worse, they were terrified. In an army where initiative could get you denounced and killed, officers learned to do exactly what doctrine and their superiors told them, and nothing more. So the Red Army that invaded Finland was rigid. It followed its plans even when the plans were failing. It attacked in the massed, head-on style it had been trained for, the style suited to the open plains of Eastern Europe, and it had little capacity to adapt when that style met a frozen forest and an enemy who refused to fight the expected way. And the third weakness was the simplest of all. The Soviet soldiers were not prepared for the cold. Many lacked proper winter clothing. They had no white camouflage, so their dark uniforms and vehicles stood out against the snow like ink on paper. Their vehicles and weapons froze. Their field kitchens, their fuel, their warmth, all of it was tied to the road and to the column, and a soldier cut off from the column in that cold was a soldier with hours to live. So picture the giant now, as it truly was in December of 1939. Enormously strong on paper, and in practice strung out helplessly along narrow forest roads, led by frightened officers who could not improvise, dressed in dark clothing that made them targets, dependent on a fragile supply line for the warmth that kept them alive, and surrounded on all sides by a forest they could not enter and an enemy they could not see. Down in the south, on the Karelian Isthmus, the Finns met the main Soviet thrust with their fortified defensive positions, the Mannerheim line, and held it through December in grinding battles at places like Taipale and Suma and Kolla, where a Finnish saying was born: Kolla holds. The fighting on the isthmus in those first weeks was its own lesson in how badly the Red Army's strengths could be wasted. The Soviets attacked the Finnish fortifications head-on in massed waves, sending their tanks forward in clumsy frontal assaults, poorly coordinated with their infantry. Time and again, the Finnish defenders let the tanks roll over their positions and then cut down the foot soldiers following behind, separating the armor from the infantry that was supposed to protect it. The same fatal split that would prove decisive in the north. Tanks that pushed on alone were hunted down and destroyed. The Soviets fed division after division into these attacks and were thrown back with appalling losses, the snow before the Finnish lines piling with their dead. The Mannerheim line was not impregnable and it was thinly held, but for 2 full months, the Finns made the Soviets pay a butcher's bill for every yard and held. It was a defensive triumph and it bought the time that everything else depended on. But it was in the northern forests against those road-bound columns that the Finns produced the tactic that would become the signature of the entire war. They had been handed, by geography and by Stalin's own failures, the perfect conditions. Now they needed the method to exploit them. They found it in the woodpile. Here is the word, and here is the idea, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Motti is an old Finnish word from the world of forestry. It means a stack of cut logs, roughly a cubic meter of timber, the amount you might cut and pile up and then split into firewood. It is a homely, practical, rural word. And the Finnish soldiers, many of whom were themselves men of the forest, reservists who had spent their lives logging and hunting and skiing through exactly this kind of country, took that word and turned it into a tactic, because the tactic worked exactly the way a woodsman works. When you have a long log, you do not try to split the whole thing at once. You cut it into short, manageable lengths first, and then you split each length on its own. That is the Motti. The long Soviet column strung out on the road was the log. And the Finnish ski troops, instead of trying to meet that column head-on in a battle of strength they could never win, used their mobility to cut it. They would strike the road at several points at once, severing the column into separate isolated segments, each one now cut off from the others, surrounded, trapped on its stretch of road with the forest on every side. Each of those trapped segments was a Motti, and once a Motti was formed, the Finns destroyed it at their leisure. The genius of it was that it turned every Soviet advantage into a liability. The enormous size of the column, its greatest strength on open ground, became a fatal weakness because a huge force packed onto a narrow road is not a fist. It is a row of helpless targets that cannot bring its numbers to bear. The Finns, on skis, white against the snow, moving silently through the forest the Soviets could not enter, struck where they chose and vanished before the Soviets could respond. They attacked the field kitchens so the trapped men could not eat. They attacked the fuel so the vehicles could not run and the men could not warm themselves. They cut the supply lines and let the cold do its work, and the cold on a Soviet soldier cut off from his kitchen and his shelter at 40 below zero was a death sentence. Some Mottis the Finns assaulted directly. Others they simply surrounded and left to freeze and starve, coming back to finish them when they were too weak to resist. They were splitting the firewood. The classic demonstration of the Motti, the one that has gone down in military history, came at a place called Suomussalmi and on the Raate road that led to it in the last days of December 1939 and the first days of January 1940. The Soviets had sent 2 full divisions, the 163rd and the 44th, totaling something on the order of 45,000 men with tanks and artillery, driving toward the town of Suomussalmi, aiming to cut Finland in half at its narrow waist and reach the Gulf of Bothnia. Against them, the Finnish commander, Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo, had his 9th Division, around 11,000 men, many of them local reservists who knew every trail and frozen lake in the region. Silasvuo did not try to hold a line. He cut. First, he isolated and destroyed the lead division, the 163rd, hacking it apart around Suomussalmi between the 27th and 29th of December. Then came the 44th Division, a fully equipped motorized division sent down the single Raate road to relieve the 1st, stretched out along that narrow forest road for miles. The Finns cut the road in front of the division, cut it behind, and then cut it again and again in the middle, chopping the whole division into a chain of separate Mottis. And then, over the first week of January, they destroyed it. The men on the road, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to leave the road, attacked from the White Forest by an enemy they could barely see, froze and starved and died. The aftermath on the Raiate Road became one of the haunting images of the war, though it is the result of the tactic rather than the tactic itself. When it was over, the narrow forest road and the woods on either side were strewn for miles with the frozen wreckage of a division. Abandoned tanks and trucks sat where their fuel had run out or their crews had died. The bodies of thousands of Soviet soldiers lay in the snow where the cold had taken them, many of them frozen into the postures they had died in, some still huddled around the remains of fires they had lit in desperation, fires that had only made them easier targets in the dark. The Finns who walked that road afterward described a silence and a scale of death that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Today, that same stretch of road is a place of memorial in Finland, lined with stones, one for each unit, a quiet monument to the winter when a great army drove into the forest and did not come out. It is worth holding the human reality of it alongside the brilliance of the method, because the method was a way of killing tens of thousands of men, many of them conscripts who had no idea why they had been sent into that frozen country to die. The numbers are almost difficult to credit. The Finnish 9th Division, outnumbered roughly 4-1, destroyed both Soviet divisions. They captured something like 43 tanks, 70 field guns, 300 machine guns, hundreds of vehicles, and more than 1,000 horses. The Soviets lost on the order of 22 to 27,000 men, killed, wounded, frozen, or captured. The Finns lost fewer than 1,000. It is one of the most lopsided victories of the entire 20th century, and it was achieved not by superior weapons or numbers, which the Finns never had, but by the firewood tactic, by cutting the log into lengths and splitting each one. And there is a final, chilling detail that tells you how complete the catastrophe was for the Soviet side. The commander of the destroyed 44th Division, General Vinogradov, escaped the encirclement with some survivors. When he reached Soviet lines, he was court-martialed for the loss of his division, and he, along with his chief of staff and his political commissar, was shot. The Red Army's answer to the disaster was to execute the man who had survived it. And Suomussalmi was not a fluke. The Motti was a method, and the Finns used it up and down the long northern front wherever the Soviets pushed their columns into the forest. Further south, around Kumo, the Finns trapped and slowly destroyed the encircled elements of another Soviet division in pockets they reduced one by one over weeks. When the Soviets, learning slowly, finally sent in their own ski troops to fight the Finns on their own terms, the Finns destroyed those too, wiping out an entire Soviet ski brigade of some 1,800 men in the forests in February, after its commander was killed and the killing frost finished the rest. Everywhere the pattern was the same. A Soviet column would push confidently down a forest road, the Finns would cut it into pieces, and the pieces would die in the snow. The Mottis dotted the map of northern Finland like the wreckage of a giant that had walked into a buzzsaw. It was not luck, and it was not a single inspired battle. It was a repeatable, teachable way of turning the enemy's mass against him, and it worked again and again. If a story like this, the close mechanics of how a small force actually defeats a giant one, is the kind of history you want more of, then a like on this video genuinely helps it reach the people who care about how these things truly worked, rather than the myths. It costs you nothing, and it keeps the real story in front of the right people. Now we come to the heart of it, the reason this video is titled the way it is. Because if the Motti was the tactic that did the work, then what about the sniper, the firebomb, and the frost? The three things everyone actually remembers. Where do they fit? The answer is the most important idea in this whole story. and it turns the popular picture of the Winter War completely inside out. Let us take the three famous images one at a time, because each of them is real and each of them is misunderstood, and understanding why is the key to the entire war. Start with the sniper. Simo Häyhä, the White Death, is one of the genuine legends of military history, and he deserves to be. A quiet, slight farmer from the Finnish-Russian borderlands, a prize-winning marksman in civilian life, he reported to his regiment when the war began and proceeded, over the course of fewer than 100 days, to kill more than 500 Soviet soldiers with his rifle, the highest confirmed sniper total in any major war, and he did much of it with a plain Finnish service rifle using open iron sights rather than a telescopic scope, keeping his profile low in the snow before a Soviet bullet shattered his jaw near the war's end. He survived, lived to the age of 96, and became the embodiment of the Finnish will to resist. Every word of that is true. But here is the thing. One man, however supernaturally skilled, does not stop an army of 500,000. 500 kills is an astonishing personal achievement, and it is also against the hundreds of thousands of men the Soviets poured into Finland, a small fraction of a percent. Hayha did not save Finland. Hayha was a product of the same things that saved Finland, a man who could move on skis through the forest, who wore white against the snow, who knew the terrain in his bones, who could get into a position the enemy could not reach and out of it before they could respond. He was a symptom of the Finnish advantage, not its cause. The very nickname tells the story. The Soviets called him the White Death, but some of their own prisoners said the real White Death was not the sniper at all. It was the cold. The legend points away from the truth. Now the Molotov cocktail. The name itself was a Finnish joke. When the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov claimed on the radio that Soviet aircraft were not bombing Finland but dropping food to its starving people, the Finns sardonically nicknamed the cluster bombs that fell on them Molotov bread baskets and then named their homemade petrol bombs Molotov cocktails, the drink to go with the food. The Finnish state alcohol monopoly mass-produced them, something like 450,000 of the things, bottles of flammable liquid that a soldier could light and hurl at a tank where the burning fuel would pour through the engine grills and into the hull. The Finns destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks this way, and the image of a man with a bottle defeating a tank became one of the enduring symbols of the war. But stop and think about how a Molotov cocktail actually has to be used. To throw a bottle of petrol at a tank, you have to get extremely close to it, within a few yards. And in normal warfare, you cannot do that because a tank does not travel alone. A tank is escorted by its own infantry, foot soldiers whose entire job is to keep enemy soldiers from getting close enough to do exactly this. A man who runs at a properly escorted tank with a bottle of petrol is cut down long before he arrives. So why could the Finns do it? Why were Finnish soldiers able to get close enough to burn Soviet tanks by the hundred? Because the tanks had no infantry with them. The Motti had stripped them away. When you cut a column into pieces and separate the armor from the men, when you scatter and freeze and kill the infantry in the forest, you leave the tanks naked, blind, and alone on the road. And a naked tank is a death trap waiting for a man with a bottle. The Molotov cocktail did not defeat the Soviet armor. The Motti defeated the armor by separating it from its infantry, and the Molotov cocktail was merely the tool that finished the job the tactic had set up. And the cold, the third great image, works exactly the same way. The Finnish winter killed Soviet soldiers in enormous numbers, tens of thousands of them, frozen and frostbitten. But the cold did not kill them because it was cold. It is, after all, just as cold on the Finnish side of the line, and the Finns, dressed and trained for it, supplied and sheltered, largely survived it. The cold killed Soviet soldiers because they had been cut off from the things that keep a man alive in the cold. Cut off from their field kitchens, their fuel, their tents, their supply line, pinned motionless and exposed on a road they could not leave. And what cut them off from all of that? The Motti. Again and again, you trace the famous killer back to its source, and the source is the same. The sniper, the firebomb, the frost. Each one is real. Each one is downstream of the one tactic that created the conditions in which a lone marksman, a bottle of petrol, and 40 degrees of frost could do their work. Mobility was the master key that unlocked all three. The Motti was the thing that turned a frozen forest into a killing ground. And notice what kind of advantage this really was, because it is the part that travels beyond Finland. The Finns were not stronger than the Soviets. They were not better armed, not more numerous, not better supplied. They had almost nothing the Soviets did not have in vastly greater quantity. What they had was the ability to move where the enemy could not, to choose where and when to fight, to be in 100 places the enemy could not reach and gone before the enemy could respond. That is mobility, and mobility is a multiplier that does not show up in any count of tanks or men. A small force that can move freely against a large force that cannot is not really outnumbered in the way the tables suggest, because the large force can never bring most of its strength to bear at any one point. It is pinned, blind, and reactive, while the small force concentrates its whole strength against one isolated piece at a time. This is the oldest idea in the art of war, older than gunpowder. The idea that maneuver can defeat mass, that the side which controls where the fighting happens controls the fighting itself. The Finns did not invent it, but in the forests of 1940, on skis and in white, they gave it one of its purest and most lethal demonstrations in modern history. That is the answer to the title. Not the sniper, not the firebomb, not even the cold. The thing that saved Finland was the tactic that made all three of those deadly. The firewood tactic, the cutting of the giant into pieces small enough to kill. But now we have to be honest, because there is a hard truth waiting at the end of this story, and it changes what the word saved actually means. Here is what the legends usually leave out. The Motti did not win the Winter War. Finland did not, in the end, repel the Soviet invasion. By the end of December, the world looked at Suomussalmi and the frozen Soviet columns and the held Mannerheim line and concluded that the Finns had, astonishingly, won. They had humiliated the Red Army. They had destroyed entire divisions. Global opinion, especially in the democratic West, rallied to their cause. The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations as an aggressor. For a few weeks at the turn of the year, it really did look as though the impossible had happened and the giant had been beaten. And then Stalin learned. This is the part of the story that the giant's enemies always have to reckon with. A giant that is willing to learn from its mistakes is the most dangerous thing of all. Stalin pulled back, stopped the clumsy broad front invasion, and put a capable commander, Semyon Timoshenko, in charge. The Soviets abandoned the foolish columns in the northern forests and concentrated their effort where their advantages actually counted, on the narrow, open ground of the Karelian Isthmus in the south, where mass and artillery could be brought to bear and the Motti could not be used. And there, in February of 1940, they unleashed a battering of overwhelming firepower, artillery firing at rates of hundreds of rounds a minute, day after day, simply pulverizing the Finnish fortifications. The Mannerheim line, which had held for 2 months, finally cracked. The Soviets broke through. And the Finns, exhausted, desperately short of men and ammunition and reserves, with the help promised by Britain and France never arriving in any meaningful way, were pushed back and forced to face the truth. They could not hold. It is worth understanding just how methodically the second Soviet effort was run, because it is the mirror image of the first. Where the December invasion had been overconfident, scattered, and clumsy, Timoshenko's February offensive was concentrated, patient, and crushing. He massed his forces on a narrow front. He brought up artillery on a scale Finland could not begin to match and used it to grind down the Finnish fortifications methodically, day after day, before sending in the infantry and tanks now working together as they should have from the start. The Finns fought with the same skill and courage they had shown all winter, but skill and courage cannot stop that weight of shells indefinitely with no reserves to plug the gaps and no resupply of ammunition coming. The Finnish line on the isthmus began to give. Mannerheim ordered a withdrawal to a second line and then to a third, the army pulling back in good order but pulling back all the same, toward Viborg, the great city of the isthmus, where the last battles of the war were fought along the frozen bay, even as the diplomats argued in Moscow. The Finnish army was not destroyed. It was never destroyed, but it was being slowly forced backward by a giant that had finally learned how to bring its strength to bear, and behind that army there was nothing left in reserve. The help from the Western democracies, much discussed and never delivered in time, would have had to cross neutral Norway and Sweden to arrive, and it remained a promise on paper while the Finnish soldiers bled. Finland had run out of road. On the 12th and 13th of March 1940, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, and the terms were harsh. Finland had to cede roughly 11% of its entire territory, including the whole of the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viborg, its second largest, and the lands around Lake Ladoga, regions that held something like 30% of the country's industrial capacity. More than 400,000 Finns, the entire population of the ceded territory, had to abandon their homes and become refugees in what remained of their own country. When the terms were announced, Finnish flags across the nation were flown at half-mast. In the narrow, strict military sense, Finland had lost. The invasion had not been repelled. The giant had taken what it wanted from the map. For the Finnish soldiers, the bitterness of it was hard to bear. Many of them had never been beaten in their own sector. They had held their ground, destroyed everything sent against them, inflicted losses out of all proportion to their own, and now they were being ordered to lay down their arms and hand over land they had defended successfully all winter, including ground no Soviet soldier had ever taken from them. Whole communities had to be told that their towns and farms and the graves of their families now lay on the wrong side of a new border, and that they had a matter of days to gather what they could carry and leave forever. The half-mast flags were not a gesture. They were grief. An army that had fought one of the most remarkable defensive campaigns in modern history was made to feel, in the moment of the peace, as though it had failed, because it had not been allowed to win and had not been given the help that might have let it. That feeling, the sense of a victory stolen and a betrayal by the great democracies who had cheered and not come, would shape Finnish politics and Finnish choices for years to come. So in what sense was Finland saved? In the only sense that ultimately mattered. It remained a free, independent, sovereign nation. And to understand why, that was not a small thing, but the whole thing. Remember Otto Kuusinen and his puppet government, the Finnish Democratic Republic, that Stalin had brought along to rule a conquered Finland. Remember that the Soviet Union in those same years did not take 11% of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. It took all of them, swallowed them whole, erased them as independent countries for half a century. That was the fate Stalin had intended for Finland. That was the plan the puppet government was meant to fulfill. And it is worth sitting with what that difference meant across the decades that followed, because it was the whole prize. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania vanished from the map of independent nations for 50 years. Their governments were abolished, their leaders deported or killed, their populations subjected to mass deportations to Siberia, their countries absorbed as republics of the Soviet Union until the empire finally fell apart in 1991. Finland endured none of that. It lost territory and it lost people, and in the Cold War it had to walk a careful, sometimes humiliating line of neutrality alongside its enormous neighbor, never able to forget who lived next door. But it kept its own government, its own democracy, its own free society, its own army, its own way of life. Finnish children were not deported to Siberia. The Finnish parliament was not abolished. A Finn in 1960 was a citizen of a free country in a way an Estonian or a Lithuanian simply was not. That is the distance between the fate Finland suffered and the fate it escaped, and the whole of that distance was purchased in the snow of that one winter by an army that lost the war and saved the nation, and it did not happen. Stalin took his slice of territory and went no further. He abandoned the puppet government. He left Finland independent. Why? Because the price had become too high. The Motti and the Mannerheim line and the whole catastrophe of that winter had cost the Red Army somewhere between 125,000 and 170,000 dead, with total casualties well over 300,000, against Finnish losses of around 26,000 dead. A ratio of roughly 5 or 6 Soviet dead for every Finn inflicted by the smaller side, which is almost unheard of for an attacker against a defender. It had humiliated the Soviet Union before the entire world, exposed the rot in its purged and frightened army, and gotten it thrown out of the League of Nations. Finland had shown Stalin that swallowing the whole country would cost far, far more than it was worth. And so, the giant, bleeding and embarrassed, took a piece and left the rest. That is what the one tactic actually did. It did not defeat the Soviet Union. Nothing Finland could have done would have defeated the Soviet Union. What the Motti did was make Finland too expensive to conquer. It changed Stalin's arithmetic so that total conquest looked like a worse bargain than a limited land grab. And that is the deepest lesson of the Winter War. The thing that small nations facing large ones have studied ever since. You may not be able to defeat a giant, but you can sometimes make yourself so costly to swallow that the giant decides you are not worth the meal. Survival for the weak against the strong is not always victory. Sometimes it is simply making the price of your destruction higher than the strong are willing to pay. There is one last, dark irony to leave you with. Watching all of this from Berlin was Adolf Hitler, and he drew a conclusion from Finland that would shape the entire war to come. He looked at the Red Army stumbling and freezing and dying in the Finnish forests, at the divisions cut to pieces by a handful of men on skis, and he concluded that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse if he kicked the door in. A year and a half later, he launched his invasion of the Soviet Union on exactly that assumption. But Hitler had misread the lesson. The Soviets had been humiliated in Finland, and unlike Hitler, they had learned from it. They reformed their army, absorbed the bloody lessons of the winter, and when the Germans came, the structure did not collapse. The same war that taught Finland how to survive taught Stalin how to fight, and taught Hitler exactly the wrong thing. The forest that swallowed the 44th Division was, in its way, the first chapter of the disaster that would one day swallow the German army too. If your own family carried any connection to this story, a grandparent who fought in the Winter War, or a family that was driven from Karelia and had to leave everything behind and start again, I would consider it an honor to hear about them in the comments. And I want to leave you with a question, because the real lesson of this war reaches far beyond Finland. How many other famous victories do you think? Do we credit to the wrong cause, to the dramatic image, the sniper, or the firebomb, or the lucky break, when the real reason was something quieter and deeper that never made it onto the poster? Tell me what comes to mind. It is one of the most useful questions you can ask about history, and the Winter War is the place I learned to ask it.